Most people picture the final surrenders of World War II as exercises in professional courtesy. Allied and German generals facing each other across polished tables, observing the rituals of military honor. But when a so-called clean Wehrmacht officer, a man with zero SS connections, attempted to negotiate his capitulation with General George Patton, he walked into something he never anticipated. The German appealed for mercy on the strength of his spotless record. What Patton delivered back wasn't simply a refusal. It was a methodical, unflinching demolition of what it truly means to serve inside a criminal apparatus. To grasp why Patton told him, quote, 1, you need to understand the ground he was standing on when he said it. By the spring of 1945, the German war machine was convulsing through its last hours. Patton understood this with absolute clarity. He saw it in every engagement. The enemy, though cornered, still carried lethal potential. Desperate men with weapons can still kill. But this was the flailing of an army stripped of unity, stripped of will, stripped of any functioning chain of command. The Third Army surged forward at a pace that outran its own supply lines, crushing what remained of German resistance with a force that felt unstoppable, because functionally it was. Beneath that sweeping collapse, though, individual commanders were running their own desperate calculations. They crossed rivers, seized towns, opened the gates of concentration camps, and funneled thousands of German soldiers into captivity every single day. The officers, swept up in those final weeks, represented a full spectrum of humanity. Some were zealots, faithful to Hitler past the point of reason, unable to process that the war was ending. Others were career professionals who had served the Wehrmacht with genuine competence, now carrying deep shame over the trajectory of the conflict and the horrors committed under Germany's flag. A great many were simply exhausted men. 6 years of unbroken war. They wanted it over. Then there was a smaller but notable category. Men who read the situation with cold precision and maneuvered to secure the best possible terms for themselves, for their troops, for whatever skeletal command structure still held together. It was inside this volatile final chapter, the fraying last days of the European war, that a German general found himself escorted before Patton at Third Army headquarters in Bavaria. His name was General Heinrich Ritter, a senior Wehrmacht commander whose forces had disintegrated under a Third Army offensive near the Austrian border. Ritter was old-school military through and through. He'd served as a junior officer in the First World War, then spent the interwar decades climbing the German military's administrative ladder, promoted on competence and discipline, not political loyalty. He was no ideological Nazi, never joined the party, no connection to the SS, no participation in the atrocities carried out across occupied territories. By his own testimony, backed by statements from his subordinates, he considered himself a soldier who fought for Germany, not for Hitler. In his mind, that line was bright and absolute. And it was the single most important thing he intended to communicate when he stood before Patton, speaking through a military interpreter in the spring of 1945. He had specifically requested this audience. That alone was unusual. Most captured German generals moved through standard prisoner of war processing without ever sitting across from a senior Allied commander. But Ritter claimed, or said he claimed, possession of intelligence on German defensive preparations farther east. He offered to share it. The price? Certain guarantees regarding how his men would be treated and protections concerning his own status as a prisoner. Patton agreed to the meeting, partly for the intelligence value Ritter advertised, partly because Patton was genuinely fascinated by German commanders, how they thought, how they justified, how they rationalized. The setting was formal. Patton's chief of staff attended alongside several senior officers. Interpreters stood ready on both sides. The atmosphere was rigidly military, characteristic of Patton's operational style, despite his famously unfiltered personal manner. Ritter walked in with a strategy already mapped in his head. He'd thought through every detail of his approach, understood how narrow the ledge was, but also that it wasn't a cliff. He possessed intelligence the Americans wanted. His service record, judged by wartime standards, carried no visible stains. Several thousand troops still answered to him in the field. Those men could lay down their weapons in good order or keep fighting at a price nobody wanted to pay. His strategy was straightforward. Present himself as a rational professional meeting other rational professionals. Build rapport on the shared language of military discipline. Negotiate from that footing. What he hadn't fully accounted for was Patton. Ritter opened by walking through his background, his career, his credentials, his deliberate distance from the Nazi Party and its corruption of the officer corps. He spoke about years of honorable service, professional standards, strict adherence to the laws of armed conflict. He emphasized that American prisoners taken under his command had received treatment consistent with the Geneva Conventions, a point he clearly believed would resonate with an American general. He called himself a soldier first, a German second, one professional addressing another, hoping for a productive exchange. Patton sat motionless, absorbing every word. When he chose to deploy it, his capacity for focused listening was surgical. He deployed it now. He wanted the full measure of this man and his actual aims before uttering a syllable. When Ritter finished, Patton let silence fill the room for a beat, then asked plainly, "What exactly the general wanted?" Ritter laid out his terms. His troops must be classified as prisoners of war with full Geneva Convention protections. Officers separated from enlisted men per established protocol. He himself would receive treatment appropriate to a senior officer. No indignities beneath his rank. Then came the addition, delivered with the faintest hesitation, the only crack in his polished exterior. These guarantees, he said, should extend to recognition of his cooperation in whatever post-war legal proceedings might touch him personally. There it was. The real ask finally surfaced. Patton had seen it coming from the moment this meeting was arranged. The general wasn't only bargaining for his soldiers. That alone would have earned a simple answer. He was scanning the horizon, tribunals, investigations, the machinery of accountability already grinding into motion, and trying to trade information and compliance for a shield. Patton studied him for a long, deliberate stretch, then said he valued the general's frankness and would match it. Prisoner treatment under Third Army command was not a bargaining chip. Every German soldier who laid down arms before the Third Army would receive full Geneva Convention protections, regardless of whether their commanding general cooperated with American intelligence. That was the standard Patton maintained. It was the right thing to do. He stated this with absolute clarity. No room for creative interpretation. Then he drew a hard line. The general's personal circumstances were a different conversation entirely. He acknowledged that he'd listened carefully to Ritter's portrait of himself, a professional soldier serving Germany, not Hitler. No party ties, correct treatment of prisoners, a clean wall between his own conduct and the crimes committed under the German flag. Patton found that portrait interesting. In his observation, German officers who genuinely upheld those standards, kept their distance from the party, treated captives properly, guarded their professional honor, happened to be the ones most desperate to say so at this particular moment in history. Meanwhile, those officers who'd done other things, signed the orders that fed the camps, authorized executions, enabled the horrors his army was stumbling across as it pushed eastward through Germany, those men showed remarkably little interest in discussing their records. He confessed he couldn't yet determine which category the general sitting before him occupied, and that making such a determination fell outside his authority. That, Ritter explained, was something for others to determine through formal proceedings and actual evidence, a process no conversation inside a Bavarian military headquarters could circumvent. He confirmed he understood, but he pressed his point again, not immunity, consideration. He claimed that on several occasions he had put his career on the line to protect men serving beneath him, that he held documentation of specific moments when he had deliberately disobeyed orders, orders that would have led to the abuse of civilians and prisoners. He was willing to produce every document, cooperate with any investigation. All he asked, he said, was that this cooperation be recognized, that he be given the chance to present his case on its merits, not swept into some blanket verdict that drew no line between honorable service and criminal action. Then he said something that changed the air in the room entirely. He said he was begging. That word, chosen with full precision. He knew exactly what it cost a German general of his rank and generation to speak it aloud to an American officer. He appealed to General Patton, soldier to soldier, to use whatever influence he held to ensure one thing, that when the reckoning came, the distinction between honorable conduct and war crimes would survive intact. Because if that distinction vanished, he argued, then military honor itself became a hollow concept, and every man who had fought to uphold it had done so for nothing. Silence filled the room, heavy, complete. Patton's officers turned toward him, waiting. This was no simple moment. The man standing before them was either exactly what he claimed, a professional soldier who had tried to serve with integrity inside a dishonorable system, or he was a sharper, more polished version of every German officer suddenly rediscovering his conscience now that the war was lost. No one could know the truth without a proper investigation, and time was something nobody had. Patton stood. He paused. Then he spoke. He said his entire career had been spent preparing for and fighting the German army, that he carried a professional respect for what German soldiers had accomplished on the battlefield, and he would not pretend otherwise. He believed there were German officers who had served with genuine honor. Their service deserved to be judged separately from those who had not. He gave his personal word. The documentation Ritter referenced would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities. The general's willingness to cooperate would be entered into the official record. Then he said something no one in that room expected. He told the general there was something he needed to hear clearly, not from a commanding officer addressing a prisoner, from one soldier giving another an honest assessment. The Germany Ritter had served, the Germany built on professional military tradition, on Prussian honor, on every principle the general had invoked as the foundation of his service. The Germany was gone, destroyed, not by Allied armies, by the men who had hijacked it and bent it toward purposes that had nothing to do with the values Ritter claimed to represent. The general and men like him had faced a choice years ago: serve that system or resist it. Most had chosen to serve. That decision carried consequences. Consequences that could not be bargained away in a Bavarian conversation in 1945. Patton made clear he was not calling the general a criminal. He didn't know. He wouldn't presume. But a plea for recognition of honorable service, arriving at this exact moment from a man who had served the machine until it broke apart, that plea needed more than the general's own testimony to carry full weight. If the record was what Ritter described, then the evidence would bear it out. And evidence was what mattered above all else. Then Patton delivered the line that outlasted everything else spoken in that room. The words his officers would remember, write down, carry forward. He said he had no mercy to give. Not because he was cruel, though he could be. Not because he missed the point of what the general was asking. He understood perfectly. Mercy simply wasn't his to give. The people who held that authority were the ones his army kept finding in the camps. The ones who'd bled out on far-off beaches, who died in hedgerows, who froze in the Ardennes. The civilians who'd been slaughtered. They were the ones who could grant mercy or refuse it. And they were gone, beyond anyone's reach now. The only thing left, the only thing any of them could still do, was make sure the record was straight, that the accounting was honest. He told the general plainly, if his service had been honorable, honesty would protect him better than mercy ever could. And if it hadn't been, no mercy in the world would be enough. Ritter was taken back to prisoner processing. The documents he'd cited were gathered and forwarded exactly as Patton had promised. His cooperation made it into the official record. Whether it helped him in the proceedings that followed, the historical record doesn't say. What is documented is this. After the meeting, Patton sat down at his desk and wrote one sentence in his diary that evening about the encounter. 3 weeks later, the war in Europe ended. Patton showed up to the official ceremonies wearing that unmistakable expression. A man who clearly wished he were somewhere else, doing something useful. He shook the right hands, said the right things, then went back to work. There was an occupation to run. The Pacific War was still grinding on. And 1,000 problems needed the sharpest operational mind the American military had. He never spoke publicly about the meeting with Ritter, never mentioned it in speeches, press conferences, or interviews before his death. It was one encounter among hundreds in a career built from such moments, and he gave it no special weight. The men who'd been in that room, though, they remembered differently. What stayed with them were Patton's final words about mercy, honesty, and accountability. And more than the words, the way he said them. No anger, none of the theatrical fire from his famous speeches. Just the quiet precision of a man who had wrestled with something hard and reached a conclusion he'd stand behind. A German general had arrived with a carefully constructed argument and one last desperate appeal. Patton heard all of it, weighed all of it, then gave the only answer that was genuinely available to him. Not the answer the general wanted, the answer that was true. And that was the most Patton thing about the entire exchange. He could have been diplomatic, could have offered vague reassurances and sent the general away feeling slightly better, could have played the gracious victor, granting some small comfort to a defeated enemy. He was capable of all of it when he wanted to be. He chose otherwise, because George Patton, whatever else you could say about him, never once in his life was willing to lie to someone who needed the truth. And the truth, in the spring of 1945, inside the Bavarian military headquarters, with the evidence of German atrocities piling higher every mile his army pushed east, that truth carried no mercy, no comfort, no diplomatic caution. It was simply what it was. Patton stated it plainly, the way he always did, and went back to work.